what we're finding when we look at research is actually the most amount of learning happens not through direct instruction and direct learning. Grammar is actually picked up in any language, whether it's your first language or your second language, it's picked up through immersion in that language. Well, okay, if that's the case, how can I actually use that immersion in rich language as a way to actually pop out some explicit teaching? Like, how do I marry those two things? And why actually do I want to marry those two things? I'm going to say there's a difference. And this, as teachers of reading and writing, is something that I think we all have to be very clear about. There is such a difference between what we call oral language and written text. In fact, the gap between those two is so great that some linguists would even go so far as to say they're like two different language systems. It's like when I talk versus when I read written text. They're so different. Oral language emerged over 300,000 years ago. Written language has been around for less than 5,000 years. So the brain is hardwired for this. This, in terms of human civilization, in terms of human neural wiring, is a fairly recent evolutionary phenomenon. That means that kids and grown-ups are more natural at acquiring that than they are at this. I mean, we know that kids write the way they talk, and we have to school them into using more academic language, more complex sentence structure, more formal vocabulary. All of that is the hallmark of written, not oral language. So if you think about the way, forget kids, the way that we talk, like if I had to talk to you, I'd sound very different from if I had to write a letter to you. Like if I had to describe my morning to my friend on the phone, I wouldn't be using direct speech. I just say, yeah, Lucy asked me to present this morning. I wouldn't say, oh, Lucy said, Hareem, will you present this morning? I thought about it. I thought back to all the times that I don't talk like that. Nobody talks like that. Yet that is how stories are written, with dialogue and punctuation, because written text and oral language are so different. So the good news, teachers, is if you are, and I actually thought when I was coming up with this, I was like, this is so good. I want this to be like a quotable quote. I'm actually going to write it out. If you are reading aloud and your students are engrossed, you are aiding in the acquisition of grammar and academic language already. Like, that's the good news. That is research. That is why? Why is that happening? Because so many of the complex grammatical structures that we don't even have name for, they don't occur when we talk. They occur when people write, and especially when Beverly Cleary writes or Roald Dahl writes, right? The complex grammatical structures and the quirky vocabulary and the academic vocabulary, all of that good stuff is in written text, not in oral language, not even in the teacher's oral language. Even the teacher's oral language, grown-ups, like PhD professors, when they talk, they don't use the kind of language they use when they write, right? Our oral language tends to have fewer words that are repeated way more often. Instead of punctuation, we use our face, we use our hands, we use the context. So when kids are actually getting written language in through their ear, they're acquiring, and the bulk of language is acquired. Very small portion of language is actually acquired, is actually deliberately learned through direct instruction. That is not to say that I think less of direct instruction. In fact, I think a teacher who is able to clearly and directly teach a concept is worth her weight in gold. To be able to teach it in a way that kids really understand it is worth her weight in gold. And I'm here to tell you today that we can absolutely use our read aloud to do some explicit instruction as well. So while the very fact of read aloud is that kids are acquiring grammar implicitly by virtue of the fact that you are reading aloud written text, but notice that I highlighted that word. Really, the curricular goal before grammar, the big curricular goal needs to be engagement. because the learning is only happening if your kids are hanging on to every word. Every linguist will tell you that grammar and vocabulary is acquired as a byproduct. The first goal is meaning, right? When you are discussing and pondering a story, or you're discussing and pondering an idea, or when you're like acquiring facts that are fascinating, then you are, as the byproduct of that, acquiring language. So the goal then is to address meaning before form. That is, make sure that kids are totally engrossed and engaged in meaning. So I'm going to ask you for just a second, what leads to that kind of engagement in a read aloud? When you read aloud to kids, if you've ever been in a situation where you're like, oh, I'm just going to shut the door and I'm just going to read aloud to my kids and it's going to be awesome and they are begging for it and they don't want me to stop, and everyone's brain is on fire and we're so worried about this dog. Will he be taken to the pound, or will this girl be able to take him home? What gets kids hanging on to the edge of their seat, other than Kate DiCamillo spins a pretty good story? What in our teaching do we do to make read aloud really engaging? Go ahead and plop your thoughts in the chat box for a second. Yes, 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 yes. Those of you who are saying an expressive voice, or prosody, or reading with expression, or your voice is your most powerful tool. If you listen to books on Audible, which I do, you know that the narrator can make or break a story. Robin Hobb is my latest obsessive craze right now. I'm reading all of those trilogies, and those 16 books together make one series. It's like any Audible listener's like dream come true. It's like 22 hours for each book. And hooked as I am on her series, I had to recently return a book to Audible because I was like, the narrator, her voice, she doesn't match the emotion of her voice to the emotion of. So I will say to you, the first thing when you're reading aloud is make sure you're like competing for the Oscars. You have to get your kids super engaged. Miss Honey cannot sound like the Trunchbull. And the Trunchbull sounds different when she's angry versus when she's terrified. That's got to be a different Trunchbull. That's what's going to hook your kids into the story. And by the way, not just that the story is great, you can take something that is kind of boring, right? Like something that kids may not have picked up on their own, and make that really interesting by making it a little interactive, doing a little bit of the written text, lifting your head, and doing a little bit of the oral language. Oh, has that ever happened to you? Wouldn't that be interesting? Or who knew that avocados and penguins have so much in common? Who thought that a penguin was not a bird, but actually, is it a bird? Is it a fish? Avocado, is it a fruit? Is it a vegetable? Like those kinds of conversations stemming off of a read aloud about penguins or avocados. How do you take text and make it super engaging? Once you have that lens of read aloud is my jam. And by the way, I often say to principals, I'm like, if you want to hire a new reading teacher, more than anything else, just say, I'd love to hear you read aloud to kids. That, I think everything else we can sort of teach through professional development. A love of literature, you cannot fake. So if you are a reading teacher because you love literature, because you think, oh, some words are just so quirky and some people's language is just so gorgeous, then teaching grammar via read aloud is going to come naturally to you. So focus, therefore, is first read for meaning before you want to read for the content or for the story. But once you're doing that, once you kind of have kids engrossed in the meaning, you do want to think of like revisiting, following up on previously taught grammar concepts during your read aloud. So for instance, I taught you the serial comma, right? I taught you that there's a comma can separate items in a list. Well, then while I'm reading aloud to you, I want to find places where there are sentences that do that. And when I get to that sentence, after I have first read for content, right, I might revisit a sentence and say, wait, let me read that sentence again, listen for it. Let me see if you can hear the serial comma. Better yet, get your comma hand ready as I read this aloud. See if you can hear the serial comma. The chick's mother and father take turns feeding it, comma. keeping it warm, comma, and protecting it from predators. Could you hear that comma? All right, hold up your fingers. All right, let's count out all the items in that list that the comma is separating. The chick's mother and father take turns feeding it, keeping it warm, and protecting it from predators. Let me actually put that sentence under the document camera. And by the way, somebody just told me that transparent Post-its have come out. I haven't yet seen them, but if they have, I would put one of those transparent and underline the sentence and circle the commas. But I would only do that if I have first read for content and for story. That's not the first, like I'm not using this, like this is my vehicle for teaching grammar. Right? But my first focus is penguins. And once kids are really engrossed in penguins, oh, by the way, remember that thing that we learned? Look, this author, while she's teaching us penguins, is doing that. And you can do so much if you start looking at even your nonfiction. I mean, fiction, I feel like is easier, but even your nonfiction text to teach like beautiful grammatical concepts. It's just like you have to be hunting for the grammar that you're teaching to naturally occur in the most thought-provoking, the most intriguing texts. This page is from When Lunch Fights Back, which is a 5th grade read aloud. And I recently taught kids elegant variation, which is a grammatical concept where when you're writing about a nonfiction topic, you don't just say, the cat is a great animal. The cat makes a good pet. We should all keep cats. Cats lower blood pressure when you stroke them. Cats will rid your house of rodents and mice. You don't want to keep saying cats, 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 cats. You want to say, this feline ball of fluff, this natural predator, popular pet, where you don't just say cats, 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 you kind of use more elegant varied ways of saying cat. So let's look at this piece of writing and take out all of the cats and put like more elegant words that we could say, oh, by the way, that's not just something we're doing. That's something that the best texts do. Remember yesterday when we were reading about the hagfish and the slime that it oozes? I just want to point out, look at that. A hagfish slithers along the ocean bottom, moving like a snake. This primitive deep sea creature. Who? What are they talking about? Instead of saying the hagfish, the hagfish, the hagfish, they're saying the primitive deep sea creature. Do you see how that's elegant variation for? In other words, the grammar concepts that you are teaching, hunt for them in the read alouds. Now, teachers think priority. Okay, because if the bulk of language is acquired rather than taken in through explicit instruction, that is not to say that explicit instruction shouldn't happen. That is to say, I'm going to spend 5 minutes teaching elegant variation, but I'm going to spend 30 minutes reading aloud. And if that's the case, then I can keep hearkening back to previously taught grammar concepts, tucking them into my read aloud where and when they occur. So I am looking for quirky sentences or sentences that have multiple commas in them. Or if I just taught my kids about punctuating dialogue and I'm reading Because of Winn-Dixie, I want to put a page in front of kids and be like, oh, just look at how Kate DiCamillo punctuates dialogue here. What are you noticing? Because I know this page that we just read between this conversation between Gloria Dump. Oh, look at that. She said, he said, what are you noticing? I said, new paragraph. Oh, new paragraph, new paragraph, new paragraph. How many new paragraphs? Let's count. Who's talking here? How many people are talking? All right, I'm going to read it. Let me see if you can hear how many people are talking. All right, whenever a new speaker, and of course my voice is aiding them in understanding that, right? Nobody talks in this way. They're like, oh, so he and I were having a conversation about getting a new dog. We wouldn't punctuate it in direct speech like that. That's what books do. So reading books aloud is a way, and here's the takeaway, big takeaway for this 15 very rushed minutes. Reading aloud is a way for you to bridge oral language and written text. The goal of school is to bridge the gap between oral language and written text. Out of the about 7,000 something languages that are alive in the world today, only about 3,500 of those have a written text. And those are the language. If you have a written text, if you have a community of speakers that is able to express ideas in the written form of a language, that language lives. Consider what I just said. I speak a couple of languages. My mother tongue doesn't have a written script. I know the language loss that happens. Therefore, my kids are not speaking that language as well as I did. I didn't speak it as well as my parents and my grandma did. Her peculiar turn of phrases were never codified into literature, and hence they're getting lost. And that is a reality. Teach your kids that the language, the rich language that they use, can be expressed in a written way. Grammar and punctuation are tools for that. Let it be driven by meaning. That's why reading and writing workshop matter. That's why read alouds matter. That is to say, grammar is a tool, but the bigger goal is meaning.